Memoirs of the Reverend George Whitefield, Chapter 3. From the time of his embarking for Georgia to his re-embarking for England, 1738. In the latter end of December 1737, he embarked for Georgia. This was to him a new, and at first appearance, a very unpromising scene. The ship was full of soldiers, and there were nearly 20 women among them. The captain of the ship and the officers of the regiment, with the surgeon and a young candidate, gave him to understand that they looked upon him as an impostor, and for a while treated him as such. On the first Lord's Day, one of them played on the hautboy, Hautboy, and nothing was to be seen but cards, and little heard but cursing and blasphemy. This was a very disagreeable situation, but it is worthwhile to observe with what prudence he was enabled to behave among them, and how God was pleased to bless his patience and persevering endeavors to do them good. He began with the officers in the cabin in the way of mild and gentle reproof, but this had little effect. Footnote: I could do no more for a season. Then while I was ready, now and then, so to turn my head by way of reproof to a lieutenant of the soldiers, who swore as though he was born of a swearing constitution. Sometimes he would take the hint, return my nod with a "Doctor, I ask your pardon," and then to his cards and swearing again. MS. End of footnote. He therefore tried what might be done between decks among the soldiers, and though the place was not very commodious, he read prayers and expounded twice a day. At first he could not see any fruit of his labor, yet it was encouraging to find it so kindly received by his new red coat parishioners, as he calls them, many of whom submitted cheerfully to be catechismed about the lessons they had heard expounded. In this situation things continued for some time, but all this while he had no place for retirement, and there was no divine service in the great cabin, both which he greatly desired. At last he obtained his wish. One day, finding the ship captain a little inclined to favor him, he asked him to suffer him now and then to retire into the round room where the captain slept, and offered him money for the loan of it. The captain would not take the money, but readily granted his request. Soon afterwards, the military captain, having invited him to a dish of coffee, he took the liberty to tell him that though he was a volunteer on board, yet as he was on board he looked upon himself as his chaplain, and as such he thought it a little odd to pray and preach to the servants and not to the master, and added that if he thought proper he would make use of a short collect now and then to him and the other gentlemen in the great cabin. After pausing a while and shaking his head, he answered, "I think we may, when we have nothing else to do." This awkward hint was all he got for the present, yet he was encouraged thereby to hope that the desired point would be soon granted. They were detained in the Downs by contrary winds for nearly a month. The soldiers by this time became more and more civilized, and the people at Deal heard him gladly. There he preached thrice, at the invitation of the ministers, and often expounded in the house where he lodged. This work was very delightful to him, but he was suddenly called away by a fair wind, about the end of January, 1738, just after he had preached in Upper Deal Church. Whitefield sailed from the Downs of Georgia a few hours only after the vessel which brought Wesley back from thence cast anchor there. The ships passed in sight of each other, but neither of them remarkable men knew that so dear a friend was on the deck at which he was gazing. But when Wesley landed, he learned that his coadjutor was on board the vessel in the offing. It was still possible to communicate with him, and Whitley was not a little surprised at receiving a letter which contained these words: "When I saw God by the wind which was carrying you brought me in, I asked counsel of God. His answer you have enclosed." The enclosure was a slip of paper with this sentence: "Let him return to London." Wesley, doubting from his own experience whether his friend could be so usefully employed in America as in England, had referred the question to chance, in which at that time he had great confidence, and this was the lot, footnote, which he had drawn. Footnote: This remarkable incident of Wesley's predilection for the practice of sortilege is not noticed by either of his biographers. Whitefield himself relates it in a letter published at the time of their separation. "We sailed immediately," he says. "Some months after, I received a letter from you at Georgia, wherein you wrote words to this effect: though God never before gave me a wrong lot, yet perhaps he suffered me to make such a lot at that time to try what was in your heart. I should never," says Whitefield, "have published this private transaction to the world, did not the glory of God call me to it. It is plain you had a wrong lot given you here, and justly, because you tempted God in drawing one." Whitefield afterwards, in his remarks upon Bishop Lavington's book, refers to this subject in a manner which does him honor. "My mentioning," he says, "Mr. Wesley casting a lot on a private occasion, known only to God and ourselves, has put me in great pain. It was wrong in me to publish a private transaction to the world, and very ill-judged to think the glory of God could be promoted by unnecessary exposing my friend. For this I have asked both God and him pardon years ago. And though I believe both have forgiven me, yet I believe I shall never forgive myself, as it was a public fault. I think it should be publicly acknowledged, and I thank a kind Providence for giving me this opportunity of doing it." End of the footnote. But Whitefield, who never seems to have fallen into this superstition, was persuaded that he was called to Georgia, and even if he had not felt that impression upon his mind, the inconsistency of returning to London in obedience to a lot which had been drawn without his consent or knowledge, and breaking the engagements which he had formed, would have been glaring, and the inconvenience not inconsiderable. He betook himself to prayer. The story of the prophet in the book of Kings came forcibly to his recollection, how he turned back from his appointed course, because another prophet told him it was the will of the Lord that he should do so, and for that reason a lion met him by the way. So he proceeded on his voyage. Being again on board, he was much comforted with the hope of doing good in the great cabin. Having no better place, he generally every night retired with his friend, the Honorable Mr. Habersham, Habersham, and his brother and 2 servants behind the round house for prayer and other religious exercises. Sometimes he observed Captain Whiting hearkening within. One day, finding on the captain's pillow the independent wig, he exchanged it for a book entitled The Self-Deceiver. Next morning the captain came smiling. He inquired who made the exchange. Mr. Whitefield confessed the charge, and begged his acceptance of the book, which he said he had. From thenceforward a visible alteration was seen in him. The other captain also, about the same time, met him as he was coming from between decks, and desired that they might have public service and expounding twice a day. In April following, he thus mentions the happy effect of their very slow passage. "Blessed be God, we now live very comfortably in the great cabin. We talk of little else but God and Christ, and scarce a word is heard among us when together, but what has reference to our fall in the first, and our new birth in the second Adam." In about a fortnight they reached Gibraltar, whither they were bound to take in more soldiers. There a Major Sinclair had been so kind as to provide a lodging for him unasked, who, with the other military gentlemen, even Governor Sabine and General Colombian, received him most courteously, being apprehensive that at a public military table he might be more than hospitably entertained. By way of prevention he begged leave to remind His Excellency of an observation made in the book of Esther on the court of the great Ahasuerus, that none did compel. He took the hint and gentilely replied that no compulsion of any kind should be used at his table, and every time was carried on with great decorum. The officers attended at public worship with order and gravity, and the ministers were behaved with great civility, and all concurred to give him invitations to preach, which he did twice or thrice in a week. Footnote. Strange and unusual was the scene, both with respect to the place and the people. The adjuncts, promontories, and the largeness of the rock of Gibraltar Help me to enlarge my ideas of him, who is his strength, setteth fast the mountains, and is girt about with power. And the place being, as it were, a public rendition for all nations, I thought I saw the word in epitome, manuscript, end of footnote. And in the evening and mornings, when not on board, he expounded, conversed, and prayed with a religious society of soldiers who had liberty from the governor to assemble at any time in the church. His evening expositions were attended not only by the soldiers, but by officers, ministers, and town people. And from all that could be judged, his labors were not without the divine blessing. Finding another society of religious soldiers there, belonging to the Church of Scotland, he sent them, as well as the former, some proper books, talked with several of them, and endeavored to unite both societies together, urging in them the necessity of a Catholic disinterested love and of joining in prayer for the advancement of the Redeemer's kingdom. This exhortation also, by the blessing of God, had a good effect, and 2 or 3 of the latter society being drafted out for Georgia, desired leave to go into the ship with Mr. Whitefield, which was readily allowed them. Before the embarkation of the soldiers, by the general's consent, he gave them a parting discourse in the church, and afterwards, from time to time, as the weather permitted, he preached to them on board with respective ships. Colonel Cochrane, who commanded, was extremely civil, and soon after setting sail, there was such a change in Captain Mackie that he desired Mr. Whitefield would not give himself the trouble of expounding and praying in the cabin and between decks, for he would order a drum to beat morning and evening, and he himself would attend with the soldiers on the deck. This produced a very agreeable alteration. They were now as regular as in the church. Mr. Whitefield preached with a captain on each side of him and soldiers all around, and the 2 other ships' companies, being now in the trade winds, drew near and joined in the worship of God. The great cabin now became a Bethel. Both captains were daily more and more affected. A crucified Savior and the things pertaining to the kingdom of God were the usual topics of their conversation. Once, after sermon, Captain Mackie desired the soldiers to stop, whilst he informed them that to his great shame he had been a notorious swearer, but by the instrumentality of Mr. Whitefield's preaching he had now left it off, and exhorted them for Christ's sake to go and do likewise. The children were catechismed, and there was a reformation throughout the whole soldiery. The women cried, "What a change in our captain!" The bad books and packs of cards, which Mr. Whitefield exchanged for Bibles and other religious books, abundancy of which were given him to disperse by the society promoting Christian knowledge, were now thrown overboard, and a fever that prevailed in general through the whole ship helped to make the impression sink deeper. For many days and nights he visited between 20 and 30 sick persons, crawling between decks upon his knees, administering medicines or cordials to them, and some such advice as seemed suitable to their circumstances. The sailors did not escape the fever, and Captain Whiting gladly went with him to visit them. One of them in particular, who had been a notorious scoffer, sent for him in a bitter agony, crying out upon and lamenting his wicked life. The cadet, who was a cabin passenger, being also seized, was wounded deeply, told Mr. Whitefield the history of his life, and informed Captain Mackie of his desire to leave the army and return to his original intention, having had a university education, devoted himself to the service of God. Mr. Whitefield was also himself seized, but through the divine blessing recovered, and was soon able to perform the burial service over the ship's cook, who had lately said he would be wicked till 2 years before he died, and then he would be good. But alas, this boaster was cut off in about 6 hours. They landed the beginnings of May 1738. After preaching his farewell sermon, he arrived at Savannah on the 7th of that month. Upon this voyage, many years after, he made the following reflection: "A long, and I trust, not altogether unprofitable voyage. What shall I render to the Lord for all his mercies? Besides being strengthened to go through my public work, I was enabled to write letters and compose sermons, as though I had been on land. Even at this distance of time, the remembrancy of the happy hours I enjoyed in religious exercise on the deck is refreshing to my soul. And though nature sometimes relented at being taken from my friends, and little accustomed to the inconveniency of a sea life, yet the consciousness that I had in view of the glory of God and the good of souls from time to time afforded me unspeakable satisfaction. One Mr. Delamont, whom John Wesley, footnote, had left as a schoolmaster at Savannah, received Mr. Whitefield at the parsonage house, which he found much better than he expected. Footnote. The Reverend John Wesley was of inferior size, his vision marked with intelligence, singularly neat and plain in his dress, a little cast in his eye, observable on particular occasions, upright, graceful, and remarkably active. His understanding, naturally excellent and acute, was highly stored with the attainment of literature, and he possessed a fund of anecdotes and history that rendered his company as entertaining as instructive. His mode of address in public was chaste and solemn, though not illuminated with those effusions of elegance which marked, if we may use that expression, the discourses of his rival George Whitefield. But there was divine simplicity, a zeal, a venerableness in his manner, which commanded attention and never forsook him in his latest years. When at fourscore, he retained still all the liveliness of vigorous old age. His health was remarkably preserved amongst a scene of labor and perpetual exertions of mind and body, to which few men would have been equal. Never man possessed a greater personal influence over the people connected with him, nor was it an easy task to direct so vast a machine, where amidst so many hundreds wheels in motion, some moved eccentrically and hardly yielded to the impulse of the mainspring. We need not speak of the exemplariness of his life. Too many eyes were upon him to admit of his halting, nor could his way have been maintained a moment longer than the fullest conviction impressed his people that he was an eminently favored saint of God, and as distinguished for his holy walk as for his vast abilities, indefatigable labor, and singular usefulness. His enemies reviled him and would, if possible, rob him of the mend of well-deserved honor by imputing to him objects below the prize he had in view. Never was there a more disinterested character, but he was a man and must have been more than man, if with the consciousness of his own devotedness, the divine blessing on his labors, and the high admiration in which he was held by his followers, he had not sometimes thought of himself more highly than he ought to think. We exhibit no faultless monsters. Elias was a man of like passions as ourselves. Mr. Wesley is going to give an account of himself to his proper judge, by whom, doubtless, all his inquiry is pardoned and his infirmities covered. And now that envy and enmity have been some time laid asleep in his grave, his character rises in general estimation and is most highly respected by those who knew him, and it will now hardly be a question with any man whether he would rather have been John Wesley, who died worth £10, than Lavishton, Bishop of Exeter, who so bitterly reviled him. As a man, as a Christian, as a minister, we shall not, it is to be feared, looked upon his like again speedily. After passing through evil report and good report, during more than 60 years of incessant labor, he entered into his rest in the 87th year of his age. Whatever ignorance of his real character, the fatuity of prejudice, or the insolence of pride, may have suggested, the day is coming when his great and adorable Master will condemn every tongue that has risen up in judgment against him, and say in the presence of men and angels, Well done, good and faithful servant, enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. See an impartial and History of the Church of Christ, Volume 3, page 274, by the Reverend T. That's spelled Huw EIS, and Rector of All Saints, Aldwych, Northamptonshire, chaplain to the late Countess Dowager of Huntingdon, and chaplain to the Right Honorable the Earl of Peterborough. End of the footnote. Having met some of Mr. Wesley's converts here, he on the morrow read prayers, expounded in the courthouse, and waited on the magistrates. But being taken ill of an ague and fever, he was confined for a week. When he recovered, he found every part bore the aspect of an infant colony. And what was more discouraging still, it appeared likely to continue so by the nature of its constitution. The people, he says, were denied the use of both rum and slaves. The lands were allotted them according to a particular plan, whether good or bad, and the female heirs prohibited from inheriting, so that in reality no place people there on such a footing was little better than to tie their legs and bind them and bid them walk. The scheme was well meant at home, but as too many years' experience evidently proved, was absolutely impractical in so hot a country abroad. However, that rendered what I had brought over from my friends more acceptable to the poor inhabitants, and gave me an ocular demonstration, which was what I wanted. When the hint was given, footnote, it was first proposed to me by my dear friend Mr. Charles Wesley, who, with General Oglethorpe, Oglethorpe, had concerted a scheme for carrying on such a design before I had any thought of going abroad myself. End of the footnote. Of the great necessity and promising utility of a future orphan house, which I now determined by the divine assistance to get about in earnest. The Salzburgers, Saltzburgers, at Ebenezer, I found had one, and having heard and read of Professor Frank, Franck, had done in that way in Germany, I confidently hoped that something of the like nature might be owned and succeed in Georgia. Many poor orphans were there already, and the number was likely soon to be increased. As opportunity offered, I visited Frederica and the adjacent villages, and often admired, considering the circumstances and disposition of the first settlers, that so much was really done. The settlers were chiefly broken and decayed tradesmen from London and other parts of England, and several Scotch adventurers, Highlanders, who had a worthy minister named Macleod, Macleod, a few Moravians, and the Salzburgers, who were by far the most industrious of the whole. With the worthy ministers of Ebenezer, Monsignor Greenock, and Bolkinus, I contracted an intimacy. Many praying people were in the congregation, which, with the consideration that so many charitable people in England had been stirred up to contribute to Georgia, and such faithful laborers as Monsignor Wesleys and Ingham had been sent, gave me hopes that, unpromising as the aspect might be, the colony might emerge in time out of its infant state. Some small advances Mr. Ingham had made towards converting the Indians, who were at a small settlement about 4 miles from Savannah. He went and lived among them for a few months and began to compose an Indian grammar. But he was soon called away to England, and the Indians, who were only some runaway Creeks, were in a few years scattered or dead. Mr. Charles Wesley had chiefly acted as secretary to General Oglethorpe, and he went to England to engage more laborers, and not long after, his brother, Mr. John Wesley, having met with some unworthy treatment, both in Frederica and Georgia, soon followed. All this I was apprised of, but think it most prudent not to repeat grievances. Through divine mercy, I met with respectful treatment from the magistrates, the officers, and the people. The first I visited now and then. The others, besides preaching twice a day and 4 times on the Lord's Day, I visited from house to house. I was in general most cordially received, but from time to time found that something in Latin, though lowered in their circumstances, a sense of what they formerly were in their native country remained. It was plain to be seen that coming over was not so much out of choice as constraint, choosing rather to be poor in an unknown country abroad and beholden to relations, or live among those who knew them in more affluent circumstances at home. Among some of these, the event, however, proved that the word took effectual root. I was really happy in my little foreign cure, and could have cheerfully remained among them had I not been obliged to return to England to receive priest orders and make a beginning towards laying a foundation to the orphan house. And thus the place I intended to hide myself in became, through my being obliged to return for these purposes, a means of increasing the popularity which was already begun, but which by me was absolutely unforeseen and as absolutely undesigned. In August, he settled as schoolmaster in an adjacent village, leaving Mr. Haversham at Savannah, and parting affectionately with his flock, he went to South Carolina. At Charleston, he paid a visit to Commission Garden, and at his entreaty preached the next Sabbath morning and evening in a grand church resembling one of the new churches in London. The people at first despised his youth, but his engaging address soon gained their general esteem. Mr. Garden thanked him most cordially and apprised him of the ill treatment Mr. Wesley had met with in Georgia, and assured him that were the same arbitrary proceedings to commence against him, he would defend him with his life and fortune. He also said something about the colony of Georgia that much encouraged him, as if he thought its flourishing was not very far off, and that Charleston was 15 times larger now than when he, Mr. Garden, first came there. It had been his practice in Georgia, especially in Savannah, to read prayers and expound and visit the sick twice a day. On Sunday he expounded at 5 in the morning, at 10 read prayers and preached, and at 3 in the afternoon, and at 7 in the evening expounded the church catechism. How much easier it was for the clergy in England, Scotland, or America to find fault with such a faithful brother in the ministry than to follow his example. End of chapter 3, having been read by Peter John Parisi, also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God. More readings and sermons can be found on www.archive.org or on www.sermonaudio.com.